Have you ever wondered what you would do if you suddenly discovered that everyone around you was plotting to erase you from your family's history? I never imagined that one day I would experience this. It wasn't a choice. It all started with a strange message on my phone, an unsent invitation, voices whispering my name in groups where I never showed up. That day, my name simply didn't exist on the list of people who should be present. I remember looking at my watch, trying to understand if it was real or if I was exaggerating. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of danger was as strong as their silence. Words got stuck, invitations disappeared, and when I realized it, it was as if my presence was a mistake. I felt my hand go cold just thinking about what would happen next. My name, my history, everything was about to be erased from the Hayes family. But for you to understand how it all got to this point, I need to show you who I was before that message. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my small apartment on the north side of Houston, trying to plan my week at the hospital, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was August 24th, 2021. The heat that morning was already over 100 degrees. I worked 2 shifts, one at Memorial Hospital on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and another at a private clinic on Westheimer Street. It had been that way ever since I decided to become a nurse. My name is Clara Hayes. I am 28 years old, and I was born in New Haven, Connecticut, but I have lived in Texas since I was 11. The move came after I lost both of my parents in an accident. I went to live with my grandmother, Ruth, the only one in my family who never tried to mold me to please anyone. She was a retired nurse, and she was the one who taught me that caring for someone was more than bandaging bandages or administering medication. It was about sitting by someone's side, listening and accepting the silence, without having to prove anything to anyone. I grew up watching my grandmother wake up early, make strong coffee, cut up fruit for breakfast, and talk about what was happening in the world. Ruth would read the entire Sunday newspaper, line by line, and she would always save the crossword puzzles for me. At 12 years old, I could already identify some medicines just by the smell of the box. She used to write everything down in a notebook with a blue cover, dates of appointments, names of patients who became friends, cake recipes. I always thought it was strange how detail-oriented she was. What I didn't know was that, years later, these details would have a huge impact on my life. Her apartment was on the corner of Maple Avenue and 2nd. It was old, with a hardwood floor that creaked with every step. My childhood there was filled with simple birthdays, a stray dog named Dusty, and afternoons spent listening to stories that seemed to have come from another century. My relationship with the rest of the Hayes family was never the same as it was with Ruth. My uncle, Charles, was a real estate developer. His wife, Martha, was rigid and never said anything out of line. My cousins, Emily and Eric, grew up in a world of privilege, travel, and rules that I never understood. Family dinners were always formal, as if everyone was rehearsing for a role. I always sat at the edge, watching, trying not to make a mistake. My routine over the past few years was a mix of long shifts, stale coffee, and the constant feeling of reaching for something that never came. I wore an old wristwatch that Ruth had given me the day I graduated. It no longer kept time properly, but I kept it on, maybe out of stubbornness or out of fear of losing what little connection I had left with her. When I had time off, I liked to walk in Buffalo Bayou Park. Sometimes I would sit for hours on the grass, listening to people talk, trying to imagine what it would be like if everything were different. It wasn't an easy life, but it was mine. I had a childhood friend, Camilla, who would sometimes call me to see if I was alive. She lived in Austin, but she would always text me on birthdays or when she saw something that reminded her of me on TV. That August day, when my phone vibrated, I thought it was just another appointment reminder, or maybe a message from the clinic asking me to cover a shift. What appeared on the screen was different. A family group, Hayes reunion, that I had never been included in, and a conversation that was clearly not meant for my eyes. I read my name there, along with the words, ungrateful, and better not invite. My hand felt cold as I reread the message, trying to figure out if it was real. It wasn't just any mistake. It was a warning, a clear message that I wasn't part of their plans. I took a deep breath, put the phone down on the table, and stood still for a few minutes. I tried to swallow, but my throat closed up. I knew that after that, Nothing would be the same again. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare. Now I want to know from you, what would have been your reaction if you discovered, by accident, that your family had excluded you from something so important? Write in the comments what would be the first decision you would make. Would you face the contempt or leave everything behind? I sat there, staring at my phone screen, trying to understand when I had become just an annoying detail to that family. It wasn't surprising, but it hurt. The Hayes family had always been well known in Houston. Their address was in a gated neighborhood, their new cars were in the driveway, and their parties seemed like competitions to see who had the most important connections. My Uncle Charles was the kind of person who shook hands with everyone and looked them straight in the eye, but he never really looked at me. His office on San Felipe Avenue had boards of certificates, pictures with politicians, old golf trophies. Once, when I was 15, I sat down in one of those leather chairs to ask for help with the payment for my nursing degree. He listened, but he had already made up his mind before I finished speaking. To him, spending money on a college degree that wasn't a law school, a business school, or a cutting-edge medical school was like throwing away the family name. I left there feeling like I was an underdog for wanting what I wanted. Back then, my grandmother Ruth was still the only one who really encouraged me, but it was never easy. My Aunt Martha was always discreet. She didn't say much, but she controlled everything behind the scenes. Her hair was always in place, her clothes were neat, and her expression was stern even when she smiled. She was the kind of person who remembered the name of every guest at Christmas parties, but she never cared if I was eating right or paying the bills. I remember one night in December of 2017, dinner at their house. I was dressed in hospital scrubs, having come straight from a 12-hour shift, my pants stained with coffee, my hair hastily tied up. Emily, my cousin, opened the door and wrinkled her nose. No one asked how my day was. My seat at the table was near the window, as far away from the center of attention as possible. They talked about investments, Charles's new projects, the trip to Aspen, Eric's school. The only time my name came up was when someone asked if I had ever passed a public exam, as if working in a private hospital was something for those who hadn't achieved anything better. My father, Paul, was the exception in every way. He gave up the Hayes family name to open a mechanic shop in Connecticut, shunned conventions, traded his suit for an old t-shirt, and only returned to his mother's house when he needed to. I saw in his photos a kind of freedom that no one there accepted. He died in 2006, in a car accident on the interstate, on a rainy Saturday. I was 11 years old. After that, everything changed. I went to live with Ruth, who, even though she missed her son, never tried to change me into someone else. She taught me to cook, took me to community bazaars, and showed me that money can solve problems, but it's no excuse for thinking you can do anything. The rest of the family never forgave what they called my father's rebellion, and in a way, they took that hurt out on me. I always felt like I was the wrong piece on the Hayes' board. Birthdays were held in rented rooms, gift lists were sent by email, and souvenirs with the family crest on them were given. On my birthdays, Ruth would make carrot cake and coffee, put on an old CD, and that was it, just the two of us. And sometimes Camilla, when she could sleep over. It wasn't grand, but it was sincere. I never saw myself in that logic of status, unlimited credit cards, and international travel. Once, I tried to attend a family business meeting just to understand why they were so formal. Charles didn't even try to hide it. He said that wasn't my place, that I should think of something more appropriate. I left there with sweaty palms, trying to hide my embarrassment. At least at the hospital, no one cared about your last name. What mattered was how you reacted when the heart monitor beeped, or how you dealt with a patient in crisis at 3 a.m. At Memorial, the digital blood pressure monitor was my ally on long shifts, along with the pocket flashlight for pupil exams and the simple stethoscope Ruth gave me. I learned to respect each shift, to listen more than I spoke, and to understand that humility is not learned the hard way. For the Hayes, it was all about keeping up appearances, not admitting weakness. I fit in better in the cold hallways of the hospital than in their living room. Even among my cousins, I was a special case. Emily studied abroad, spent time in New York, and always showed up at parties telling stories about events that I only saw on TV. Eric was a fan of sports cars. He had been driving his father's BMW since he was 16 and made a point of rubbing his achievements in my face. Once I dropped a glass at one of these parties. The silence that followed lasted for seconds, but it felt like judgment. No one said anything, but the look of disapproval was clear. I went to get a cloth to clean it up, but Martha had already called the maid. I got the message. There, those who made mistakes didn't deserve a second chance. Choosing nursing was almost an act of resistance. I didn't have anyone in my family who understood or accepted me. The most I heard was Charles saying that if I liked helping others so much, I should at least go into medicine, because nurses don't give orders, they just follow orders. Hearing that hurt, but I would rather swallow it hard and move on, because I never wanted to be like them. I was proud of every patient I managed to relieve pain, of every child who smiled when I carried a lollipop hidden in my pocket, of every time Ruth said, in a low voice, that she was proud of me. The worst part was that even though I knew I didn't fit in, I still tried to seek some kind of approval. Deep down, everyone wants to be seen, to belong, even if it's just once. But for the Hayes, pride and status were more important than blood ties or any shared history. In that group chat, reading over and over the words ungrateful and better not to invite, I realized that my attempt to belong had never been more than an illusion. They had decided years ago who was an insider and who was an outsider. And in that moment, I knew for sure that what was coming would test everything I thought about family, belonging, and loyalty. But what happened next, no one could have ever predicted. Stories like this unite us because they show us that not every blood tie guarantees true belonging. Only those who experience it firsthand understand the weight of what is happening now. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Each person here strengthens a community made of courage, resistance, and choice. Now pay attention, because what came next completely changed everything I believed about family. I thought I knew what it was like to be left out, but I had no idea what was coming. Things really started to sour in the summer of 2020, when Charles showed up at Ruth's house on a Saturday afternoon to discuss selling the lake house. It was July, and it was over 100 degrees in Houston, and he arrived with that black briefcase full of contracts and spreadsheets, ready to convince my grandmother that it would be best to sell before the end of the year. It was her favorite house, a simple place in Livingston that my grandfather had built in 1986. Every corner had a story. The musty-smelling couch, the old barbecue in the backyard, the crooked picture frames on the bookshelf. Ruth always said she wanted to keep this place for her grandchildren, for her whole family, and she kept saying it was priceless. Charles looked at numbers, talked about appreciation, high taxes, expensive maintenance. He looked at me as if I were just a bump in the road. When Ruth asked for my opinion, I was direct and said that selling made no sense at all, that it was everything she valued most. That was the day I felt a turning point. The family's first reaction was to ignore me, but little by little the whispers began. The following week, I arrived at the hospital for a 10-hour night shift and found cold messages from Emily, saying that they were worried about Ruth, that she was confused, that maybe I was influencing her decisions too much. From then on, anything I did became a reason for comment. In September, they tried to schedule a family meeting about Ruth's assets and didn't tell me. I found out later from the photos posted in the family group, those images in which everyone was smiling for the camera, except me, who didn't even know the meeting was going to happen. I felt my hand tremble in my lab coat pocket when I saw the notification. It was clear that from then on, the rule was to leave me out. That Christmas, I went to pick up Ruth to spend the night with me. Her house was quiet. The old clock said 8 o'clock. When I arrived, I found her in the armchair, with a small gift on her lap, an antique butterfly brooch, something she said her mother had given her when she was 18. She looked at me and asked if I was still willing to keep fighting for what was right, even when no one else seemed to care. I didn't need to answer. I took the brooch, held it tightly, and I could tell that she knew exactly what was going on. It was her calm, attentive gaze that gave me the strength to endure the upcoming exclusions. Over time, the invitations to birthdays, graduations, and reunions began to dry up. I found out by chance, in early 2021, that Eric was going to graduate from Rice University. I saw the news on a college website. That same week, Martha blocked me from the Hayes family events group. There was no warning message. My circle grew smaller and smaller. Instead of looking for explanations, I tried to focus on my work. In nursing, at least, people depended on what I knew how to do. At the hospital, I worked with vital signs monitors, infusion pumps, and oxygen machines. There, everything was straightforward. If a patient had a high fever, all I had to do was calibrate the digital thermometer, check the medication, and adjust the shift orders on the whiteboard. It was a relief, amid so much uncertainty, to deal with problems that could be solved with precision. The betrayals began to get worse when Charles accused me, in a phone call that took place on February 15, 2021, of manipulating Ruth. He said that I spent too much time with her, that I influenced her decisions, and that this worried the family. I didn't know if I was angry or tired. I always thought that the person who wanted to protect my grandmother the most was the one who was the most in a hurry to make decisions for her, without even asking her what she wanted. There was one time when I arrived early at the lake house and found Emily and Martha organizing boxes. They said they were cleaning, but I saw an old jewelry box missing from the closet. When I asked, Martha responded quickly, saying that she was sorting it out to have it cleaned. I didn't believe her, but there was nothing I could do. My isolation was complete in April, when I heard from a friend that the family was planning a birthday party for Ruth, but they had left me out on purpose. He had seen the invitation on a social network where even neighbors had been tagged. I sat in the living room with the butterfly brooch in my hand, listening to the rain hitting the glass. Ruth noticed my mood that Sunday. She only said one thing: "You are the only one who truly looks me in the eye." Then I knew for sure that to her, I was not invisible. The worst part was that all of this was happening while her health was starting to falter. Doctor appointments increased. New medications appeared on the shelves, and her routine depended on exact schedules and monitoring. I organized every pill box, wrote down symptoms, and looked for ways to keep the house running, because no one else cared. The rest of the family limited themselves to quick phone calls or messages in group messages that I wasn't even part of. Their silence spoke louder than any fight. I got used to being the last to know about things, but the pain of being treated like a stranger by people of my own blood didn't lessen. On the outside, I pretended to be normal. On the inside, each exclusion was an open wound, always ready to flare up again. I felt firsthand what it was like to be cut off on purpose, to see others making important decisions without even asking my opinion. But I still had no idea what was coming next. I thought I knew what fear was, until that day. Gloria called on a Tuesday in May at 6:40 in the morning, when most people are still trying to wake up. The phone rang 3 times, and when I answered, it took her a while to get through. Her voice was different, lower, and at that moment I understood that something had happened. It wasn't Charles. It wasn't Martha. It wasn't anyone in the family. The woman who stayed by Ruth's side until the end was the one who thought it was fair to tell me first, even though she knew it wasn't her place. She simply said, "Clara, Mrs. Ruth passed away early this morning while she was sleeping. She didn't feel any pain, she just slept. And I stayed here until now so as not to leave her alone." I sat there on the bed, staring into space, trying to absorb what I had heard. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I stayed still for about 20 minutes, remembering the details of her face, her laugh, her small hands, and her habit of correcting the newspaper with a blue pen. That same day, I received an automated message from Memorial Oaks Funeral Home with information about the wake's time. The name of the person in charge was someone else, a receptionist, and only then did I understand that everything was being decided without me. I tried calling Martha, but she didn't answer. I tried calling Charles, but he quickly hung up. At 11:30, I went to Ruth's house, but everything was locked. On the porch, there were 2 boxes of condolence flowers that someone from the condo had probably left. It was no longer my home. I spent the rest of the day without eating, looking at the pile of her medical records, which were still in my bag from her last appointment, written in the same round handwriting she used to list her grocery shopping. The wake was the following Friday, May 28th, 2021. The main hall at Memorial Oaks is large, with velvet chairs and a strong smell of cloves and disinfectant. I arrived 10 minutes before it started. Everyone was there except me. When I looked for my name on the list of family members, I realized that they had placed me with the distant relatives, near the back of the room. I sat next to a second cousin who barely remembered my name. No one greeted me. No one asked how I was. People came by, hugged Charles and Martha, praised the family, commented on Ruth's generosity. I just listened, quietly, remembering her voice at Christmas, the butterfly brooch that was still stuck in my purse, the cookie recipe I could never quite make. On the table in the entryway, I saw a photo of her as a young woman, holding a cup of tea. That was a portrait of who she was before everything got so complicated. During the ceremony, the pastor spoke of gratitude, of legacy, of how Ruth was a strong woman. Emily read a text. Eric gave a speech about his grandmother who loved everyone equally. At no point did they ask me to come up or say anything. I spent 2 hours listening to stories told by people who had not experienced even half of what I experienced with her. I held the brooch in my hand, feeling my skin sweat. As I left, I greeted Gloria, who hugged me and simply said, "She knew." I walked home, unable to drive, unable to feel my feet on the ground. On Monday, I received an unexpected message. It came from Emily, but it was clearly for someone else, or at least not for me. She asked the group of cousins if they had already scheduled a meeting with the lawyer for the reading of the will. My name was not among the guests. Right then, I understood that they were ready to leave me out of the last important decision of Ruth's life. My stomach turned at that moment, but I held the phone tightly. I was not going to let it go. If someone thought they could erase me even from mourning, they would discover that no one takes away a granddaughter's right to fight for the person who was always the only one who was by my side. And I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. I arrived at the door of the Miller and Hayes meeting room at 9 o'clock sharp, my hand sweating so much that I had to wipe it on my jeans before touching the doorknob. The hallway was silent, except for the muffled sound of the air conditioning. The pictures on the wall displayed the family's surnames, photos of Charles and Martha at old events, always smiling as if everything there was perfect. When I walked in, I felt all eyes on me. Martha had her arms crossed, looking at me with that hard expression. Emily was fiddling with her cell phone. Eric was leaning against the window. Charles was talking quietly to Edward, the lawyer, a man with gray hair and thick-rimmed glasses. He was holding a dark blue folder full of papers and sealed envelopes. No one said anything as I approached the oval table. The silence was thick, as if the air had stopped. I sat down in the chair in the corner, put my bag on my lap, and stared at the details. The digital clock showing 5 minutes past 9, the pitcher of mineral water next to the disposable cups, the document stacked to Edward's left. My breath became shallow, and I had to remember to inhale slowly so as not to let my nervousness show. Before Edward could say a word, Martha decided to begin. "We've already shared everything, Clara. I don't think you needed to come." She spoke loudly, for everyone to hear, as if the case had been closed before it began. Edward ignored her comment. He took a large envelope out of his briefcase, opened it carefully, and began to read without beating around the bush. Will of Ruth Hayes, executed on the 8th day of February, 2021. He got straight to the point. There was no long introduction, no time for the others to react. All assets, bank accounts, real estate, investments, and personal effects go to Clara Hayes. I heard this and stood still, only hearing my breath come out labored. The silence that followed was so loud that I could hear the zipper of my bag when I closed it. It took the others a second or two to understand. Charles was the first to stand up. His chair scraped against the wooden floor. He gestured, spoke loudly, wanting to know how that was possible. Martha kept saying that I had manipulated Ruth, that she had not been in a position to make any decisions for months. Emily, for the first time, put down her cell phone. She whispered something to Eric, and he shook his head, looking at me with an anger I had never seen before. The accusations came quickly. They said Ruth was out of her mind, that I must have been fooling her, that I had only stayed by her side for so long out of self-interest. No one looked me in the eye. I tried to answer, but my voice wouldn't come out. I felt the skin on my face hot, the palm of my hand sticking to the strap of my bag. Edward didn't flinch. He began to present the evidence. One by one, he pulled out signed neurologist reports, tests done on exact dates, January 11th December 24th, October 3rd of the previous year. They all said the same thing. Ruth was lucid. She understood her decisions perfectly, including the choice of an heir. He also showed short videos, filmed in her living room, where my grandmother explained the reason for each item she had left for me, speaking clearly, citing dates, names, and reasons. The recordings had clean audio. You could hear the clock ticking in the background. With each document presented, the atmosphere in the room grew more tense. Charles tried to argue, but Edward countered with data, dates, signatures. At one point, Martha left the room saying that it was absurd. Emily cried quietly. Eric stood leaning against the wall, staring at the floor. Neither of them wanted to hear the real explanation. For them, it was all my fault. Even though I knew I was right, that scene wore me down inside. It was as if every minute there took a piece of me away. But I didn't give in. I held on tightly to my bag, looked at the lawyer, and asked to see all the evidence. He handed me the papers, showed me the recordings on his laptop, everything in detail, as required by the protocol for reading official wills in cases of dispute. No one left the room without raising their voices. They said they would contest it, that it wouldn't stay that way. Edward warned that all of Ruth's decisions were protected by law, and that nothing could be changed without new evidence. The tension exploded into threats and harsh words. I could barely feel my legs when I left there. But Edward walked me to the elevator. She said in a low voice, "Don't worry, Clara. She's thought of everything." And I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. When Edward opened the red folder, the mood in the room changed completely. He began to pile up handwritten letters, each with the date in the corner. August 12th, 2019, January 7th, 2020, November 23rd, 2020. The writing was small but firm. In the letters, Ruth described conversations, fights, favors asked, cold visits. I saw details I had never heard her say, like the morning Martha stopped by to pick up an old necklace, claiming she needed to borrow it for an event, or the day Eric took his grandfather's coin box, saying he wanted to show it to his friends, but never returned it. In the middle of that file, Edward separated a black-covered diary, already worn at the edges, full of notes. In it, Ruth wrote everything: medication schedules, feelings after visits, observations about who showed up and who disappeared on difficult days. She noted whether anyone asked how she was, or whether she only talked about bills and inheritance. On one of the pages, I recognized my name and Charles's. Charles called to ask for a transfer of $10,000. Didn't ask about my heart exam. Said he would call later. Didn't call. It was this type of record, simple and direct, that dismantled the family's discourse of unconditional affection. Edward didn't stop there. He turned on his laptop, opened a folder of videos, and showed me images from different dates. In one of the files, Martha is seen holding a jewelry box, looking back before closing the door to Ruth's room. In the audio, she whispers something to Eric, who is holding a gold watch and laughing, saying that no one will notice this one is missing. The video was marked as October 6, 2020. It was clear that the cameras had been installed without the family knowing. Ruth had written by hand on a sheet of notebook paper. I installed it to record everything, in case anyone needs to say that I lost my mind. That was like a punch. Knowing that my grandmother had to protect herself from the people who were supposed to take care of her affected me in a way that is hard to explain. Among the evidence was the stack of bank statements, highlighted in blue pen, showing cash withdrawals always after Charles's visits. The amounts were never round, they varied. $1,300, $4,500, $700. In the voice notes saved on her cell phone, Martha arranged for an employee to pick up new clothes before Clara comes to look at her mother's things. It wasn't just money. It was every little item that could become a reason for a fight later. Ruth even recorded loans that were never paid, dates when the family promised to pick her up for dinner and never showed up. In one passage, she says, "I don't wait anymore. I've learned to protect myself." For the first time, the extent of the neglect became clear. Charles only showed up to ask for help, almost always about some problem at the office or a bad investment. He almost never talked about his health, never asked about tests, never brought groceries or took anyone on a trip. The conversations were always quick. focused on transfers and business. In one of the recordings, he asks to use Ruth's card, saying that he's in a tight spot that month. She replies that she only has a pension, and he cuts the subject short in a hurry. Martha and Eric, on the other hand, were always interested in valuable items, old documents, family heirlooms. Emily almost never appeared in the records. She disappeared during the years she studied abroad. As Edward pointed out each item, I realized that my grandmother was not only conscious, but had made a point of documenting every detail to avoid any doubt. The neurologist's reports made it clear that she knew what she was doing. All the tests had dates, names of professionals, and stamped signatures. 3 different doctors, each one attesting that Ruth was lucid on all important occasions. In each video, letter, and statement, she anticipated the accusations that would come. She said she recorded everything, so there would be no doubt. All of that affected me in a way I couldn't explain. The shock of seeing with my own eyes the small betrayals, the daily lies, the absences, the greed, the cold way they treated those who had always been there. On the one hand, it hurt to see my grandmother's loneliness at the end of her life, the need to defend herself from those who were related by blood. On the other hand, it was a relief to no longer have to justify anything, to not carry the burden of having to convince someone that my love for her was real. At that moment, all guilt disappeared. This wasn't a matter of dispute. This was a record of the truth. I stood there, listening to the sound of the laptop closing, trying to take it all in. But this wasn't the end yet. The storm was just beginning. Charles wasted no time. Less than a week after the reading of the will, I was officially notified by a court official. The summons arrived on a Friday morning in a white envelope, stamped by the Harris County Probate Court, and scheduled for 17 days later. I opened the paperwork with cold hands, reading the pages that accused me of manipulation, of emotional abuse, of having taken advantage of Ruth's fragility. Everything there was cold and bureaucratic, but the words weighed like darts, thrown by someone who knew my every weak point. In the following days, it was difficult to sleep. The phone rang nonstop, unknown numbers, journalists wanting to hear my side, lawyers offering services. I even thought about giving up, accepting any agreement just to make it over. But Ruth's voice, recorded in so many videos, kept coming back to me. Don't bow your head to those who don't have the courage to be fair. Edward introduced me to Laura Reynolds, a litigation attorney who specializes in family law. She arrived at the office wearing a dark blue suit and looked me in the eye without rushing, as if she were truly assessing me, not as if I were a piece of paper in the lawsuit. Laura was blunt. Most of these disputes turn into a theater of accusations, but we have too much evidence to let anyone make up a story. She organized everything in chronological order: dates, times, documents, exams, videos, audios. She created a timeline showing when Ruth wrote each letter, recorded each video, and cross-referenced it with the dates of the medical exams. She said we needed to prove it to those who never wanted to see. The first hearing was scheduled for June 28, 2021, in Courtroom 7 of the Central Courthouse. The judge, Mr. McCallan, was strict and didn't let anyone interrupt. Charles brought 2 lawyers. Martha sat next to him, and Emily and Eric sat behind him, not daring to look in my direction. The room was cold, with wooden benches and a noisy air conditioning system. When Charles spoke, he used the same rehearsed speech he always used. My mother was confused. She was manipulated. No one in the family was consulted. Laura asked to show the first video. Ruth's image appeared on the screen, her hair tied up, glasses perched on the tip of her nose, speaking directly to the camera. I'm leaving everything to Clara because she was the only one who took care of me without asking for anything in return. She mentioned dates, gave examples, and mentioned episodes that only those who lived through it could detail. Charles's expression changed with each piece of evidence. Laura drew attention to the medical reports, all signed with specific dates: November 27th, January 16th, March 9th, showing that Ruth was fully capable. The judge made quick notes, glancing at me from time to time. The lawyers tried to disqualify the videos, claiming manipulation and editing, but Laura countered by showing the raw recordings with date and time metadata. In one of them, Ruth showed the day's newspaper and the digital clock in the background, saying, Today is December 24th, 2020. I don't want anyone to say I did this under pressure. The hearings dragged on for almost 2 months. There were 7 sessions, always tense, sometimes endless, with questions that seemed to never end. They turned my entire life upside down, analyzed my finances, and asked for statements from neighbors, hospital colleagues, and Gloria, the caregiver. She told me how the family barely showed up and how I took care of Ruth on her most difficult days. With each detail, the truth became clearer. I sat down and answered everything calmly, even when the questions were biased and tried to dismantle me. It was tiring. It hurt to see my relationship with Ruth being treated as a bargaining chip, but I knew I couldn't back down. The outcome came on August 15, 2021. The judge read the final decision, recognizing the validity of all the material presented. He cited the reports, the videos, the letters, and emphasized that nothing indicated any manipulation. The will was approved without reservations. Charles left the room before he finished, Martha behind him, her eyes red with anger. Emily and Eric sat there without saying a word. Laura handed me a copy of the judgment and said quietly, "Now they're going to have to accept it." The next day, Edward called to say that, after receiving formal threats of criminal proceedings, the family had returned the jewelry, documents, and even some antique furniture that had been secretly taken. I went to collect everything from the Hayes' house, with a bailiff by my side. Seeing those objects returned to the right hands was a relief, but it also made clear the extent of the damage. Winning that battle didn't erase the pain. It was just the price of being true to the truth. And even then, I knew that some wounds never truly heal, but there was still one final decision to make. And what happened next was something no one expected. The sentence was handed down and everything went silent. Charles didn't look for me, didn't send me a message, didn't even want to sign the receipt for the return of Ruth's jewelry. He disappeared completely. There were no shouts or threats in the end, just that icy indifference that says more than any fight. For many days, it seemed like the entire family had evaporated, but little by little, signs of life began to appear where I least expected them. The first contact came from Emily. She called me late on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice low, almost whispering. She didn't apologize, but she asked if I still had Ruth's old cookbook. It was a thick notebook with a worn leather cover, flour-stained pages, and crooked notes from decades ago. Emily said she missed the smell of pumpkin bread baked in Connecticut winters, the afternoons when Ruth would let her mix the ingredients, even though she knew it would be a mess. I had already decided to keep the notebook, but hearing that made me realize that certain objects are not meant to remind me of pain. I went over to her house the following Saturday. She opened the door with a tired face and thanked me silently. We sat at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours, reminiscing about Christmases past, trying to piece together fragments of memory that had outlived the pride of adults. Eric was more difficult. He sent me a short text message asking if I had seen Grandpa's old fishing box. That rusty box had been stored under Ruth's bed since 1994, filled with colorful lures and hooks I never understood what they were for. Eric was the only one who fished with Grandpa. I hesitated before answering, but I knew that returning the box would leave the door open for some kind of truce. We arranged to meet at a little cafe on the corner of Kirby and Richmond at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. He arrived with a suspicious look on his face, but when he saw the box, he couldn't help but smile. He didn't say much, just thanked me, but he stared at it for almost 15 minutes. When he said goodbye, he said, "I guess we forgot what was important." I just shook my head, holding back the words I hadn't been able to say back in court. The biggest surprise of all came from Camilla, a distant cousin, the daughter of one of Ruth's older brothers. She lived in Galveston and never showed up to any gatherings. One day, she suddenly arrived at my apartment, carrying a box of old photographs. "I found these things at my mother's house when she moved to a smaller place. I think you should have these." We opened the box right there, spreading out the photos on the living room table. Ruth as a teenager in a white dress, her grandfather's wedding, picnics at Memorial Park, vacations at the lake in 2002. Camilla began to tell stories I had never heard, like the time Ruth ran away on her bike to see a concert without her mother knowing, or how she would save up coins for months to buy Christmas presents for her grandchildren. Each photo, each story, was a piece of my grandmother that no one else had the time or desire to preserve. Those simple, straightforward conversations began to disarm something inside me. For the first time since the beginning of that chaos, I was able to laugh at old memories without feeling guilty, without fear of being accused of anything. It wasn't a reconciliation in the classic sense. There was no movie hug or declared forgiveness. It was something quieter, a discreet truce amidst the rubble of what was left. Emily and Eric agreed to visit the lake house before deciding what to do with it. We went together, for the first time in years, and spent an entire Saturday cleaning, reminiscing, finding old notes from Ruth hidden among the books. Even Camilla showed up, bringing sandwiches and another box of forgotten things. I understood that weekend that some bonds are not remade the way we imagine. Sometimes, all we can do is give up what no longer fits, share what is good left, laugh at the stories of the past, and admit, silently or out loud, that everyone made some mistakes. But if there is a choice, let it be for lightness. Because when the masks fall and there is nothing left to hide, forgiveness becomes just an exercise in humanity, rather than a gesture of greatness. But I had no idea how much this would transform me, because the real turning point was yet to come. With the court's decision finally recognized, the pile of documents, bills, and keys in my hands seemed like an impossible weight to carry. But little by little, it stopped being a burden and became a responsibility that made sense. I spent the first few days visiting each property, reviewing contracts, discovering boxes of old papers and objects scattered around rooms that no one had visited in years. Among receipts and letters, I found lists made by Ruth of everything she would like to see happen after she was gone. Some things were simple, like keeping the porch of the lake house open for family picnics. Others had an almost pleading tone. If you can, help those who became invisible at the end of their lives. There are many people forgotten by their own children, Clara. I read this sentence in the letter she left especially for me, written with that blue pen she only used for serious matters. Use what I left you to multiply love, not just wealth. That echoed in my mind as I organized the paperwork to transfer bank accounts, close inventory, and respond to emails from banks and lawyers. It didn't take long for the routine of spreadsheets and bank meetings to start to seem colder than any family exclusion. Instead of just accumulating, I decided to transform what I had inherited into something that had meaning for the world, just the way Ruth had always taught me. In September of that year, I sat down with Laura Reynolds and an accountant to design the scholarship program. I called it the Ruth Hayes Palliative Care Scholarship. The goal was simple: to provide an opportunity each year for nursing students interested in caring for the elderly at the end of their lives. I made sure to include mentoring, internships, and psychological counseling, because I knew from experience that no one is ready to deal with death, loneliness, and abandonment without support. The first class, in February of the following year, had 6 scholarship students. All of them came from peripheral neighborhoods, and some worked night shifts to pay for their books. Seeing these people getting the chance to graduate made me understand, for the first time, how much change can be made with just one gesture. The Ruth Hayes Foundation was born out of conversations with Gloria, the caregiver, and a small team of volunteers. We managed to rent an old house near Buffalo Bayou Park and adapt it to accommodate elderly people who had lost contact with their families, who needed medical care and someone to talk to during the day. The first resident was Donna Albertina, 78 years old, forgotten by 2 children who never showed up again. She came in with her head down, and, within 3 months, she was already coordinating the afternoon reading group and teaching crochet to the caregivers. After her came others: an old man who played the guitar out of tune, a woman who was blind in one eye and only wanted to listen to soap operas on the radio. With each new name, another story of abandonment was patched up with affection, routine, and a little attention. Every month, the foundation also organized coat drives, bingo afternoons, movie sessions with old films, and family gatherings to try to somehow reconnect those who wanted to give the past another chance. These weren't grand events, nor did they make headlines, but they turned difficult days into bearable memories. I created partnerships with clinics and universities, bringing in nursing interns to look after the elderly. They learned in practice what no book can tell: to listen more than to talk, to accept that not everyone will be remembered, and even so, to treat each person with respect. Sometimes I would sit alone in the foundation's office, reading Ruth's letters, seeking her advice on decisions that kept me up at night. In one of them, she wrote, "Love doesn't need an audience, only courage to not waste it." I've never been so proud to follow that example. The inheritance money was just a means to an end. Ruth's true legacy was to prove that behind every broken family, something good can still be rebuilt. And in that moment, I realized that the love she left behind was endless. It just needed a place to start over. But as much as I wanted to believe that everything was finally resolved, there was one last thing I needed to do before closing this cycle. And it was that last gesture that would change everything forever. Over time, Ruth's house changed its function. The old furniture remained, but now it coexists with the signs of the new times. Colorful placemats on the dining table, message boards on the kitchen wall, sounds of conversation coming from the porch almost every afternoon. There is no longer that heavy silence of someone waiting for bad news. The grandfather clock still marks the time in the living room, but now it announces times for shared meals, visits, and volunteer meetings. Little by little, the house began to smell of fresh coffee and warm bread, almost always made by one of the foundation's ladies, who arrive early and go straight to the kitchen, as if they had lived there all their lives. I organized the dinner on a Friday in spring, 3 months after the foundation was up and running. I didn't invite everyone, only those who really had a special place in Ruth's heart. Gloria arrived with a chocolate cake covered in sprinkles. Camilla brought one of those homemade potato salads. Eric showed up carrying his old fishing box, saying he wanted to show it to the old folks who liked to tell river stories. Emily brought flowers from her mother's garden. She was shy at the door, but gradually she started to open up. We set up a large table on the porch, under the hanging lights that Ruth loved to turn on warm nights. Each person brought a dish, a souvenir, a feeling of longing. While everyone was talking, I spent some time observing small details. Ruth's picture frame by the window, the recipe book already open on the pumpkin bread page, Mr. Albino's laugh, who barely knew my grandmother but talks about her as if they were childhood friends. There was no speech, no formality, just a shy toast to life, to what was left and what was gone. At one point, Gloria told how Ruth insisted on having tea at 5 in the afternoon, even when she was already tired, just to have an excuse to gather whoever was around the house. Emily remembered a summer when the children all slept together on the mattress in the living room, and Camilla described a stormy night when Ruth stayed up reading stories until everyone fell asleep. No one talked about money, inheritance, or court. Only laughter, advice, strange recipes, and Ruth's habit of not letting anyone leave without eating a piece of cake. People took turns in the kitchen, washing dishes, filling lemonade pitchers, replenishing the bread. Each gesture there was a way of thanking Ruth for everything she was and for everything she left behind. As the evening drew to a close and the guests slowly left, I sat alone on the porch, looking at the lights reflected in the window. I felt a peace that was hard to explain. It wasn't a euphoric happiness. It was a kind of calm certainty. I understood that my greatest inheritance wasn't money, or real estate, or valuables. It was the courage to move forward even without support, the strength to defend those we love even when it seems like no one understands, and the ability to transform pain into care, absence into companionship, rejection into comfort. Ruth's true wealth was never recorded in a document, nor in a judge's ruling or in a bank balance. It was in those little stories that survive the test of time, in the smell of cake, in hidden letters, in tight hugs in the hallway of the house. This was the kind of wealth I carried now, an invisible inheritance, impossible to take or dispute. That night, before I turned out the lights and closed the door, I thought of the words Ruth had written. Love multiplies when it no longer fits in one heart. And I realized, once and for all, that no one will ever be able to take that away from me. The night on that porch closed a cycle that no one could ever rewrite. Every detail of that dinner, from the smell of bread coming out of the oven to the sound of laughter crossing the hallway, made it clear that the true sense of inheritance was never in the bank statements or signed papers. It is in what remains when the doors close and only what was lived, felt, shared without fear, is left. The weight of the house has changed. What was a scene of dispute has become a refuge for stories and memories. With each encounter, it becomes even more evident that what Ruth left me cannot be taken away by court, argument, envy, or time. There is no sentence that can erase the value of someone who chose to love, and to truly love, when no one else had the courage. Now it's up to you to carry this story with your own impressions. I want you to say in the comments, "Legacy is not lost." Write these words to mark what happened to you today. Tell me, would you have had the courage to give up your pride and transform pain into a new beginning? I want to know what went through your head while you lived every minute of this story. And it's not enough to just feel, you have to act. Comment now. I know this story has left its mark on you. There is no way to hear a story like this and still feel the same. Because here it is not just about possessions or disputes, but about the strength to transform rejection into meaning and build new roots when the old ones have been torn out. Stories like this remind us of what we are made of when everything falls apart. That is why you are already part of this movement just by being here. So, leave your like now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. You need to keep following each story that is yet to come. Here, every detail matters. Every story is real. And those who stay until the end never forget it, because they feel it in their skin, in their chest, where it really matters. Stories like these cannot be forgotten or left aside. They transform, challenge, and show that there is choice, resistance, and redemption until the end of the road. You are part of this. And since you have come this far, don't waste any time. The next video is already on the screen. What happened today shook your certainties, but what you are about to watch now could turn everything upside down. Get ready for an even more unexpected story. Click now, because those who stop halfway never discover what else they could experience.